possibly the most iconic super heavy vehicle of Warhammer 40,000. Today we're talking tactics about
Imperial Knights?
For shame.
Anvil of War! Let's talk tactics!
So with the recent point drops in 2019's chapter approved, the Baneblade is back on the menu. I don't want to get ahead of myself and say it's now a competitive unit. I do see some potential from this model. It is, if not anything, an amazing distraction for your opponent. Your opponent's going to sink tons of firepower into this thing. And when we get into the statistics and some of the things that you can do with it, the damage output and the overall durability of this thing is going to make it a force to be reckoned with on the tabletop. And again, with that point drop, you might see this a little bit creep its way a little bit more into Astra Militarum lists. And I hope to see more of these on the tabletop. And I know I'm definitely going to be throwing one in some of my 40K lists going forward, just because it's just such a cool model. So let's get into the statistics on this thing. So base statistics, not talking about degrading statistics because it does have degrading stats. It has a weapon skill of 5+. I mean, it's a tank. It's not swinging too hard at enemies in close combat, or is it? We'll talk more about that in a sec. But strength 9, toughness 8, 26 wounds on this guy, 8 leadership, and a save of 3+. 8 leadership's only going to really come into play if it gets targeted with any psychic abilities or anything like that. But 3+ armor save, I mean, that's good. I would like to see a 2+ on it since it doesn't have an invulnerable save or something like that to just kind of counter it to Imperial Knights, because I mean, Imperial Knights are such a good option in comparison to these guys that I think that would kind of give them a little bit, maybe even the playing field a little bit more. So moving on to their degrading statistics. Between 14 and 26 wounds remaining, it's got a movement of 10 inches, a 4+ ballistic skill, and 9 attacks base. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about the melee potential of this beast. But between 7 and 13 wounds, you're at movement of 7 inches, 5+ ballistic skill, and a attack characteristic of 6. From there, you're going to the 1 to 6 bracket of having a movement of 4 inches. I mean, this thing is now smoking. It's got a 6+ ballistic skill, cannot hit the broadside of a barn, and it drops down to 3 attacks. Definitely not scaring anybody anymore in combat. But at the same time, if you get to that point, if you get to the last bracket on this guy, you're not really worried about its damage output at that point, because it's already absorbed at that point 20 wounds with a base, again, of toughness 8 and a 3+ save. I'm guessing that your opponent has put in quite a bit of shooting of their firepower into this thing to get it to that point. So moving from that onto some of its weapons options, its equipment options. So this thing has a plethora of weapons. If you can't tell just from the model, I mean, this thing is bristling with guns. You've got a demolisher cannon on the front, 24-inch range, now upgraded as of recent FAQ to D6 shots base. You don't have to worry about how many models it's targeting anymore. It's now just a D6 shot weapon. At 24-inch range, it's pretty good. I mean, the base damage on this thing, it's strength 10, AP -3, and D6 damage, so it's a good weapon. You've got a twin heavy bolter that it comes with standard. I mean, everybody knows what a heavy bolter does. It's good for clearing some enemy infantry. You have the Baneblade cannon, the iconic weapon of this model. This thing is 3d6 shots, 72-inch range, strength 9, AP -3, and 3 damage flat. 3 damage flat is going to threaten some big stuff with that strength 9 to really punch through enemy big targets. 3d6 shots is also great. I mean, on average, you're going to get about 10 to 11 shots, and that's pretty good. Additionally, on the turret mount, you have the autocannon. It's 72. It's 48-inch range. I wish it was 72 inches. 48-inch range. It's strength 7, 2 damage flat. I mean, AP -1, it's pretty good. In addition to that, you can take from there, you can expand on to having several options. Now, I'm not really going to talk about all the pintle-mounted weapons. I mean, storm bolters, stubbers, all that kind of stuff. There are a couple light infantry killing options for it if you want to throw the points on them. Don't really see the it's necessary to do that. I mean, it's already an expensive model and it does a lot of damage as it is, so maybe don't go that direction. It can, however, take side sponsons. Now, the side sponsons on this thing are definitely worth taking, as opposed to the Lehman Russ, which I don't think they're necessarily worth it. But on the Baneblade, you're going to want to pimp this out with some side sponsons. Now, it can take between 2 and 4 side sponsons, and those side sponsons come with a las cannon on top, and then the option of twin heavy flamers or twin heavy bolters as the firing weapon. Now, this is modeled with the heavy flamers. The idea is that I'm probably going to use it as a Cowchan model, and we'll talk a little bit about the specific regiments and how they can affect these vehicles. But I find that the heavy bolter is probably the most common thing to take because it's cheap and because you can just chug so many shots. Some of the strength 5 shots, especially with the 2 that it already comes with base. So now you're going from 2 to 6 heavy bolters. Yeah, and it just gives them the opportunity of threatening multiple different targets. Allocating your fire properly, you're going to take out, an infantry squad. You might take out a big vehicle or strip some wounds off of an Imperial Knight or something big with all the other weapons. So it just gives you that the options of hurting multiple things. So going from that into the special rules for the Baneblade. Now this is where it gets interesting. So its big special rule is the Steel Behemoth. Now this has multiple special rules all tied into one big rule. It clearly is a Steel Behemoth on the tabletop. The model just screams Steel Behemoth. So what does this special rule actually do? The model does not suffer for the penalty from moving and firing with heavy weapons. So right there, that tells you that this thing is a mobile gun platform and you want it to be moving up the table as much as possible. With the limited range of the Demolisher Cannon, you're going to want to get this thing up in range so that all of its weapons are doing the damage and punching holes in your enemy. And in order to do that, you want to keep it mobile. Again, good reason to keep it moving because it's not suffering any penalties. It can fall back and charge in the same turn. Charge with a tank. Again, we'll talk about the melee potential of this thing later on, but having the ability to fall back and charge in the same turn is amazing. In addition to this, it can fire all of its weapons if enemy units are within 1 inch of it, but only the twin heavy bolters, imagine these were heavy bolters, and the twin heavy flamers, they are heavy flamers, can target units that are within the 1 inch. So essentially, all of the big guns are still going to keep firing, even if the enemy decides to engage this thing in close combat. It can't be locked down. It's just going to keep shooting. Again, it can fall back and charge also. So this thing's really never going to stop. And the fact that its sort of secondary defensive weapons can target the unit that's within 1 inch of it is pretty cool too. So if the opponent decides to take a huge blob of infantry and wrap this thing somehow, or use the terrain to his advantage in the sense that now it can't fall back because it has nowhere to go, it doesn't really matter because you don't really care. You're still going to be punching through the enemy and hitting other targets with all of its weapons. So can't slow this thing down. In addition to that, the one other thing that's part of that rule is the fact that it will never receive cover unless it's at least 50%, at least half of the model is obscured from the shooting model by terrain. So, I mean, again, to hide 50% of a Baneblade is a tall feat, but it's not impossible. And there's definitely some terrain out there, especially with like the Nova L's that you're seeing on tournament tables now. There's definitely ways of blocking and hiding this guy. It's not impossible. Okay, moving from there onto synergy with characters. Now, there's not a lot of like immediate character synergy for this guy. I think One really big one is just throwing a Primaris Psyker nearby, being able to cast the Shroud, Night Shroud, or Psychic Barrier on this. Night Shroud giving it -1 to hit, -1 to hit a Baneblade is pretty hilarious. And then also being able to give it +1 to its saves. I mean, it doesn't have an invuln, but bringing it to a 2+, again, if you manage to hide 50% of it and you're getting a +1 to another +1 to its cover, that might be worthwhile. So eventually you might get a situation where you're getting this guy up to a really reasonable armor save from that character and the spells casting on it. One thing I do want to mention is the Forge World model, the Salamander command vehicle, it being able to use its ability, the Auspex, I can't remember the exact name, but it's Auspex, to basically give them +1, a vehicle within 6 inches of it, a friendly vehicle with the same regiment keyword, the +1 to hit. So +1 to hit on this many weapons can never go wrong. Speaking of, let's move into some stratagems for this guy. So one of the big regiment stratagems I want to talk about is overlapping fields of fire. If you're going the Cadian route and you have a fully Cadian built list, you're going to want to use overlapping fields of fire on lots of on the scariest target. So the ability to inflict some damage on a scary unit with another unit, and then have this guy come in for the coup de grace, the killing strike, and finish off the big scary enemy. It's good. Next, we're going to be talking about the Vostroyan stratagem, which is Firstborn Pride. Depending on what you're going to be doing with your detachments and how you're going to incorporate the super heavy into your list, I think that really affects which regiment you choose to make these things. I mean, if you're going the route of having just like a auxiliary detachment with just one super heavy in your list, you're not going to benefit from the regimental rules. So none of the other special rules apply to it. So that being said, I think arguably the most useful stratagem on this model is Firstborn Pride, because what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to give the model +1 to hit with all of its weapons, and that is just disgusting. Again, we mentioned how incorporating like a salamander vehicle, salamander command vehicle, to be able to give it +1 to hit. You're now hitting stuff on 2+ if this thing isn't bracketed. And if it gets bracketed, you're still able to keep up with the damage. From there, you then have the ambush stratagem if you're taking to learn. The ability to hide these guys and have them jump on the table. Now with the width of the model, it's pretty close, and you're really limited with your options of where it's going to be placed, but that's an option. So from there, you have a few more stratagems that are really strong with these guys. There's the defensive gunners, which allows them to increase their overwatch. So they're now hitting on a 5 or 6 instead of a 6. So the ability to increase their damage output to stuff that's charging them, and then the fact that they're going to be able to shoot once they're in close, or once they're engaged and there's enemy models within 1 inch of them is pretty awesome. Jury rigging, I mean, if the models remain stationary, I don't know that you want to. I mean, it can regain 1 wound. This is totally situational. If it's a circumstance where this thing is just bracketed by 1 wound and you just want to bump it back up into its other bracket, it might be worth it to keep this thing stationary just for that reason. So next we're going to talk about the Crush Them stratagem. Now this thing allows the vehicle to hit in melee on a 2+. Your opponent's face, when you charge across the table, you shoot everything in sight, and then you charge this thing into close combat, and they're thinking, this guy's just mad. You're not. You're going to be using the Crush Them stratagem. Hitting on a 2+ with this vehicle's base weapons is hilarious. Now, I want you to remember that this thing had a base strength of 9. The adamantine tracks on this thing, its melee weapon, are strength user, so strength 9, AP -2, D3 damage apiece, and this thing has 9 attacks base. With doing D3 damage each when you're rolling with a strength of 9, when you're rolling 2+ to hit in melee is hilarious. And the AP -2 is going to cut through some armor. So This thing can actually charge a knight. Now, I wouldn't do it against a unwounded knight, but if you manage to strip a lot of wounds and you need to finish that knight off, this thing can charge that knight and bring it down. It can charge into nasty centurion units and things like that, and I mean, finish off those units that you really need to kill and take off the table. And it's just something that your opponent doesn't really see happening. They don't expect it as much. You only really expect it once you've played against these things a couple times, and the person, your opposing general that's using it, has done this to you. So a couple quick thoughts about the regiments that you can take with this guy. Obviously, the different synergies and stratagems, synergies with the characters and stratagems that you're going to want to use on it are affected by your composition, your army composition. If you're planning on taking this thing as a auxiliary detachment, then obviously it's not going to benefit from its regiment, the regiment keyword or the regiment rules. But if you're taking this thing in a, I mean, if you decide to make this thing Vostron and take in a auxiliary detachment just so you can use the Firstborn Pride, again, that's a good option. If you're taking it as Katachan, that's probably the most competitive option for this, because the sheer amount of D6 or D6 shot weapons that you have or can take on it is crazy, and especially if you go with the heavy flamers, and the ability to use those in like Overwatch and kind of help protect it, or use it in combat on the opponent that's within 1 inch of you. Being able to re-roll one of those dice for how many shots you're getting is pretty strong. And it's just going to up the damage output. Cadian is an obvious one for this. I mean, just the reroll ones is a good option. And then from there, I mean, it depends on what you're kind of planning on doing with it. And again, your list composition really affects what you want to do with these things. So all in all, great unit, great model, just a lot of fun to throw on the tabletop as it is. Is it a really competitive unit? I think time will tell how much that chapter approved really helped it. Once we start seeing some maybe some upcoming rule releases and updates, maybe we're going to see Astra Militarum version 2 come out for the codexes, and maybe we're going to see some gifts given in the Psychic Awakening. So I'm hopeful. I am currently working on putting LED lights and finishing painting 3 of these bad boys, just because I want to make a list that's really fun. And yeah, let me know your experiences with the Baneblade on the tabletop. Let me know some combinations if we didn't mention them in the video, and we hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks for watching.
Sponsored by...
Please support the channel by clicking the subscribe button.
Loosen up, buddy. Come on, Adam. Loosen up. Loosen up, man. Come on, these are my exercises.
That
was right on time.
No.
Right on cue. Come on.
I paused.
It was totally on cue.
I paused.
What are you doing to me?
I paused.
Why are you doing this to me? Baneblade.